Hello. I'm going to give you guys a brief rundown on some very important cosmic history, specifically relating to Earth and our solar system and how it came to be. I'm going to start about 560 million years ago, and I'm going to divvy these videos up into segments. So this will be the first portion. And I'm not going to be overly detailed. I just want to give you guys a good overview on this information. So let's dive in. There were extraterrestrial and metaterrestrial races who combined their genetic and energetic makeup. They were from harmonic universes 4 and 5. And just to give you guys some perspective, Earth lies within harmonic universe 1. So these races created a master race or a guardian race for the planet of Tara in harmonic universe 2. And they worked through a seed race called the Lyrans in harmonic universe 3. The Lyrans created the Elohim race in harmonic universe 3 as well. And I'm going to do my best to pronounce these words correctly. The Elohim race paired with the Syrian Council in harmonic universe 2. Both acted as overseers for an experiment in harmonic universe 2 called the Tyrannusium 1 experiment. And through this project, they reinforced the law of one, which is in line with unity consciousness. And initially, there were 12 primary subracial divisions. Each subrace carried a genetic slant that was derived from 12 of the primary contributors of the T1 experiment. And they each carried a fully functioning 12-strand DNA package. So the Tyrannusium race evolved for about 8 million years on Tara. And by the end of this period, there were 2 primary racial strains present, the Alanians and the Lumians. By the end of this period, there was also a substantial amount of digression taking place, disharmony, interbreeding, cultural disturbances had escalated. The Alanians were attempting to dominate the Lumians through technology. They were playing with some pretty dangerous experimentation with power generation. And the Alanians were run by an elite group called the Templar Solar Initiates. And the Templar Solar Initiates refused to follow orders from the Syrian Council. So this power struggle became known as the Syrian Rebellion. And based on these events that were taking place, the Lumians foresaw a cataclysm in their near future. So they created the Council of Mu amongst themselves. And the Council of Mu was able to assist in relocating their race to what they called the continent of Mu. And here the Elohim interbred with the Lumians, creating the race of Ceres. They also founded the priesthood of Mu, which still followed the law of one. There was a matriarchal slant in place as well. And the priesthood of Mu is still in play today. So there was a group of Alanians who did not agree with the way that their race was operating, and they sought refuge from the Ceres, and there ultimately was a reemergence of genetic lines. So the original gene code was rebuilt and purified. This new race they called the Ur-Taranates race, which was a combination of the Ceres, Lumian, and Elanian lineages. And they created the priesthood of Ur, which is also still in play today. The priesthood of Ur followed Law of One practices, but they had developed an interest in scientific application of spiritual law specifically. So, for example, portal mechanics. So, unfortunately, the power struggle between the Templar solar initiates of Alania and the people of Mu continued, and these wars were termed the Taran Wars. The power generator crystals did indeed explode, and this greatly fragmented the morphogenetic field of Tara. There was rapid pole reversal. It took about 10,000 years to restabilize the planet, and many of the beings there fled to underground communities to live for this period of time. And essentially, Tara became trapped in Harmonic Universe 2. So because of the intensity of the fragmentation, the planet was unable to proceed through its normal ascension cycle. So there was a retrogressive process that took place here. And the fragmented portion of the morphogenetic field was drawn into their sun through a black hole and into an already existing galaxy in Harmonic Universe 1, where it formed a mini solar system around an already existing star, which we know to be our sun. So one portion of the morphogenetic field fused with the sun, and the 11 other portions became planets. So remember that there were 12 primary genetic influences that were linked with the original 12 DNA strands. And when this disintegration occurred, those 12 portions of the morphogenetic field redeveloped as these planetary figures. So this took place over a very long period of time. Initially, those portions of the morphogenetic field were gaseous, and eventually they were able to accumulate more mass and become denser elements. And we know these planets today to be Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Maldek, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Nibiru, and the Sun. So the planet of Maldek was actually destroyed quite some time ago, and it is now known as the asteroid belt. And I've heard that it met its demise because of nuclear activity and war. Nibiru still exists, but its orbit is especially long, so many scientists are not aware of its connection to our solar system. And this major event came to be known as the Fall of Man, which is also biblically referenced. So the Ur-Taranates formed an agreement with several other Harmonic Universe 2 races called the Covenant of Palaidor. And this was a rescue mission for the Taran souls who were lost in the disaster. They received assistance from many extra and meta-terrestrial groups, including the Raw Confederacy, and they were basically able to transmute these cheilontic time codes or electrotonal frequency patterns, and this served as the blueprint for the reassembly process. So the Ur-Taranates were able to transmute their body forms, which included the 12-strand DNA prototype, into pure energy or consciousness. And this was done using interdimensional portal mechanics. And this collected consciousness energetically took the shape of a sphere. So they called this sphere the sphere of amenti, and the implementation of this sphere would allow for quicker evolution. It was placed in Earth's core, and it was essentially a wormhole that connected to Tara. So it linked into Tara's pre-cataclysmic past in addition to future time cycles. This disaster set in motion a loss of conscious memory, a loss of energetic thrust. So it was necessary for other planets to receive similar spheres or portions of the morphogenetic field as a blueprint. And at this time, Earth became an ascension planet. So the sphere of amenti was entered into Earth's core within the second dimensional frequency band, and they called this the Cave of Creation. This occurred about 550 million years ago, and there were many seedings in between about 250 and 550 million years ago that took place on Earth. This included many diversified species of plants, animals, insects, etheric beings, etc. So there were those who did not want to see the covenant of Palaidor fulfilled, and because of this, there were extended Taran wars that ensued, mainly on the planet of Tara, but eventually the Earth territory was secured, and the Ur-Taranates began birthing on Earth, and they called this the Taranusium II experiment, which represented the seeding of the 12 tribes out of which our present human lineage has emerged. And from the sphere of amenti, there were 5 smaller spheres that were created, which became the 5 morphogenetic patterns for 5 different races known as the cloistered races. So each race held various imprints for DNA strands. They were considered our genetic guardians of sorts, but they did not possess the degree of matter density that we are familiar with. They were also genderless. And the Native Americans called this time period the Second World. So the first world was 560 million years ago. This was the original Taranusium cultures of Tara that we talked about. So the second world took place about 250 to 225 million years ago. This would have been when the cloistered races existed. They populated the earth for many generations. They were able to help many lost souls ascend back to Tara, but they did not leave any remnants. and this was because they evolved within antiparticle Earth, so they were more etheric in nature. But the morphogenetic field of these races was eventually drawn into particle Earth, or physical density, and thus began the next evolutionary stage. So, before manifesting into an embodiment on Earth, the cloistered races divided into two main groups, and each carried half of the first DNA strand plus strands 7 through 12. And this is when a new level of polarization really came into effect in the morphogenetic field. Gender was also introduced at this time. And the first two root races were actually initially seeded on Gaia. So they evolved about 25 to 20 million years ago. And Gaia is the seventh dimensional harmonic universe 3 counterpart to Tara and Earth. So these beings were more etherically based. Similar concept here, they evolved etherically and then pulled into particle Earth. And this was possible because Tara shares planal resonance with Gaia, so Earth subsequently does as well. And these two root races were known as the Polarians and the Hyperboreans. So although both were technically more etheric in nature, the Hyperboreans resided in the antiparticle realm of Gaia. So the comparative degrees of density here are just different in both places. But they were able to successfully reconnect one of the 12 strands of DNA on Earth. So the cloistered races created 5 other portal bridges that extended from the center of the sphere of amenti, and they called these portals the halls of amenti. And each of the 5 portals opened into dimensional fields 2 through 6. So dimensional fields represent positions in space-time within the time matrix. They are stages that a planet or being will pass through in its evolutionary progression of ascension. So the cloistered races were able to pull fragmented consciousness, or these lost souls of Tara, into a bodily form within dimensional bands 2 through 6. And at this time, it took about 24 incarnations, so 2 12 cycles, to fully rebundle the 12-strand DNA package. And originally, only one Earth body was needed for this process. So the death and rebirthing cycle then were not the same as they are now. But as these DNA strands reassembled, the body form of the incarnate would progressively transmute into a less dense state and was then able to ascend to Harmonic Universe 2 on Tara. So as the lost souls returned to Tara, so did the lost portions of the morphogenetic field. So just a quick recap, there was a critical portion of Tara's morphogenetic field that was removed intentionally and placed within each of the 12 planetary figures. And this acted as energetic imprints for grid-line structures and matter form. So the bridge of frequency between Tara and Gaia became dismantled when they intentionally removed that portion of Tara's morphogenetic field. But this was necessary because that initial disruption of the morphogenetic field was going to lead to an eventual explosion of the planet of Tara if action wasn't taken. So if Tara's grid wasn't fully intact, then as it continued on its natural path of ascension, certain portions of those higher frequency bands would not be able to plug into Tara's grid because those pieces of the grid had been ripped out during the fall event. So each of the 12 planets would hold a portion of Tara's morphogenetic field, and thus Tara could draw in sustaining energy from each of those areas in the meantime. And once each planet was able to pull in its portion of the higher dimensional frequencies, it would then undergo dimensional ascension back into Tara's grid and bring with it the necessary portion of the Taran morphogenetic field. So Tara cannot ascend to harmonic universe 3 until each planet completes the manifestation of its portion of the morphogenetic field and ascends back to Tara. So, as I mentioned before, Earth's portion of the Taran morphogenetic field is called the sphere of amenti, and the standing wave pattern of this portion looks like an electric blue flame with a pale shade of green. So they call it the blue flame. And the blue flame became known as the staff of amenti, which is also an item referred to in the Bible as the staff of God, of the rod and staff. So the rod represents a standing wave pattern within Earth's core that is composed of the frequency patterns in dimensions 1, 2, and 3. And this is more orange gold in color. And the blue flame staff of amenti is composed of frequency patterns in dimensions 4, 5, and 6. So these colors just refer to the differing bands of frequency of which morphogenetic fields are composed. So remember that colors represent spectra of light. And the blue flame gateway became known as the Gates of Ivory, which later became translated in biblical terms to the pearly gates of heaven. So every human on Earth now is in some way energetically connected to the race morphogenetic field within the sphere of amenti. And it is through the halls of amenti that we must ascend in order to fulfill our evolutionary imprint as souls and return to our source. This can also be done through the Taran morphogenetic sphere within one of the other 11 planets in our solar system. So we have 5 morphogenetic fields within the sphere of amenti. And remember that since the division occurred, we're going to have 10 total spheres. And these spheres are holding various pieces of the blueprint for DNA strands 1 through 12. We still only have 5 main root races, and they represent root races 3 through 7. And these particular root races were responsible for the assembly of DNA strands 2 through 6. Each root race was paired with a cloistered race. So each root race was responsible for evolving and assembling one strand of DNA, while its companion, cloistered race, held the imprint of that strand plus strands 7 through 12. And these root races and cloistered races manifested as physical expressions on Earth over time. The cloistered race would appear first and through this race, its root race would emerge. So the cloistered races ultimately held the higher frequency DNA codes and overtones for each dimension, and then those codes would match up with the base tone frequency patterns of the body double on particle Earth, or parallel Earth, as it is also called. So the genetic codes were also called activation codes, and a soul would begin by incarnating and building up those lower frequency patterns or base tones into the DNA, and then over time they would evolve and build up higher frequency patterns or overtones into the DNA. So the DNA particles were merging with the antiparticles. And this meant that all of the DNA strands would ideally be able to eventually plug into the operating genetic codes. Remember that the DNA codes were assembled in the DNA through 24 transmutations, or 212 cycles. And as the 12-strand DNA pattern was fully restored, then the soul could ascend through the halls of amenti. So the Native Americans refer to this time period as the Third World. Technically, it was the first physical seeding. There were 60 original humans from these cloistered races, 6 male and 6 female per cloistered race. And there were also 60 original embodiments placed within parallel Earth or antiparticle Earth. So the third root race was the first physical race to appear on Earth, and this was about 15 million years ago. These were the Lemurians, and they were assigned to the second DNA strand. The fourth root race came about 9 million years ago or so. This was the Elanians, and they were assigned to the third DNA strand. Some members of these root races did successfully ascend. There were some who digressed through animal breeding and other forms of extraterrestrial contact. Many of those beings lost the ability of genetic transmutation. They also lost their immortality. There was a Syrian Anunnaki race from Harmonic Universe 2 about 6 million years ago who wanted to stop the evolution of earthly races and abandon the T2 12 tribes experiment because they feared that the mutating genetic code would contaminate the races of Tara as they ascended. There was already grid system damage on the planet. And there were other groups that simply wanted Earth for their own purposes. So these resistance groups ended up warring with the Elohim from Harmonic Universe 3 and the Covenant of Palaidor from Harmonic Universe 2. These wars were called the Electric Wars, and they were battles of pure energy. So truly spiritual warfare is what we're dealing with here. They lasted about 900 years, and Earth's environment was thrown into chaos. The human races caught in this battle either ascended to Tara through the halls of Amenti, or they were relocated to other Harmonic Universe 1 planets. Those who had lost their immortality and did not leave Earth perished. along with many animal life forms. So the battling groups eventually did negotiate a treaty, which basically said that the root races could continue evolving, but the halls of amenti would be sealed to humans until the mutations could be reversed. So these souls at this point cannot access DNA strands 4 through 6, which royally throws off the entire process of things. And this sealed particles of the physical body out of the etheric body. And this block is still carried within humans today. This is when our perception of duality between consciousness and the body arose. The energy available to the matter body became finite, and as the genetic capacity for assembling frequency was reached, the physical structure began to deteriorate. So consciousness was transferred back to the morphogenetic field. This seal made it necessary to incarnate 3 times within root races 3, 4, and 5. And the sphere of amenti essentially became a collector of souls awaiting rebirth into the 5th root race. And just to clarify, the halls of amenti were not in themselves sealed or closed. They were only sealed to incarnates carrying the altered gene strains. So, as a result of the damage from the electric wars, the Elohim had to place the sphere of amenti in dimension 4, which created a 4th dimensional frequency block within the 2nd and 3rd DNA strands. And this was called the Seal of Palaidor. And here the subconscious mind was created, or the D2 emotional body. The egotistical mind, or the D3 mental body, was created, and the D4 astral mind body was also created. So each of these layers were only able to draw in specific soul fragments, and an energetic barrier became apparent between the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th chakras and dimensions. And humans lost the majority of their relationship to Earth, and we lost our species' evolutionary memory and memory of higher dimensions. So the seal could only be released through the assembly of the 4th DNA strand and integration of those soul fragments. And the 4th DNA strand is linked with the heart center, which is also linked with Christ consciousness. And this is the purpose of the current Aryan race. Most humans have 5th race coding and are responsible for cellular clearing. Miasms also developed at this point, and they are a buildup of electrical particles within the etheric body, and they distort natural functioning of the chakra system. They also accelerate the manifestation of disease. So the release of the seal of Palaidor is necessary before the seal of amenti can be lifted, and both are achieved by assembling the 4th DNA strand. So, for a period of time following the end of the electric wars, Earth could not sustain life. Earth experienced a partial pole reversal and tilted several degrees on its axis. This was about 5.5 million years ago. And this lasted about 4,000 years. During this time, there was erratic weather, climate anomalies, tectonic shifting. And when Earth's grid was finally able to shift back into alignment, that realignment caused a quick freeze or an ice age. And this wiped out most life forms on the planet, except for those residing in caverns beneath the seas. So Earth's grid dropped vibrationally. It could no longer hold the higher frequencies of the sphere of amenti in its core. And there were extra and metaterrestrial groups that detached the sphere of amenti's morphogenetic field from Earth's core. If the sphere of amenti hadn't been removed, then the Earth would have exploded. But it was placed in a secure position in deep space within the fourth dimensional frequency bands, and this is what we refer to as the Seal of Palaidor. There were many souls that became trapped in the D2 planes until the Seal of Palaidor could be lifted. So souls would experience one incarnation, die, and then become part of the consciousness of Earth, losing their sentient identity. And unfortunately, this caused further disembodiment and fragmentation within these souls. So the Aryans or the Aryans then became responsible for assimilating these fragments of consciousness from their race 3 and 4 ancestors before they could fully ascend. And these ancestral soul fragments appeared as fragmented incarnational memory, chaotic identities, subpersonality fragments, etc. And when portions of the race morphogenetic field were removed from the planet, it took with it the DNA strand imprint through which memory was stored within an incarnate's bodily cellular memory. So corresponding DNA particles broke loose from the operating DNA strands. They lost their sequence of linear order. They were unable to translate through the neurological structure of humans into conscious perception. And this is what we call junk DNA, these strands that are stored within cells with seemingly no purpose. And at this time, dream assimilation became necessary to assemble astral awareness of the fourth DNA strand. And basically, the Seal of Palaidor placed Earth in a frequency quarantine. So this temporarily disconnected us from our intergalactic community, and humans developed tunnel vision, which is a condition that remains today within the majority of people on Earth. Within about 3 years of the removal of the sphere of amenti, a great flood came that covered about 85% of Earth's surface. And the memory of this flood, along with that of 2 others, was given to humans by the Elohim, and it was recorded in biblical history as one event. So there were actually many other periods of flooding over time, but these 3 were the most notable. The second flood occurred about 850,000 years ago, and the third flood occurred during the third seeding of the root races. All right, so stay tuned, my people. This initial slew of information is just scratching the surface. I'm going to make more of these videos because there are many other events that take place that are extremely pertinent to what is happening in our world right now. Don't sleep on it. This information was transcribed from the Guardian Alliance, and it checks out with a dozen years of regular research that I've done on these topics. If you want a more detailed version of this information, the book that I'm referencing is called Voyagers by Ashayana Deane, and it's volume 2.